أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Today I want to talk about the topic of maintenance of women in the Qur'an, and also then related to the broader topic of maintenance in Islam. Now, why are those two separate topics? Allahu A'lam. They are, especially in our day and age, because what we consider to be, or what we call Islam, does not necessarily always correlate with the Quran exactly. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. And where it does, we of course need to accept our discourses and where we come from and our traditions, and those are very important to us. I'm not one who throws the baby out with the bathwater. But also, we need to also be critical and always return back to the book of Allah and to those who uphold the book of Allah. So we have this maxim already in the Quran, already tells us that if there is a dispute amongst them, it says that obey Allah and the Messenger and those in authority amongst you, and if there is a dispute, then return back to Allah. Farudduhu ilallah wa Rasul. So we are doing that in principle, and then obviously the Quran tells us that whoever has obeyed the Messenger has obeyed Allah. So that is our basic orientation. So now we have a situation, and the situation is surrounding the rights of maintenance, that we have basically adopted the 1950s model of marriage, which has become largely unfeasible in 2025. So we now need to, not because it has largely become unfeasible, but because the discourse around it now falls into question. It falls into question because it doesn't work. Okay? So I have a very pragmatic approach, and my line of questioning will always be on account of something not working. Okay, so if, for example, you tell me that this and that is religion, and then I experience this and that, and it doesn't have the desired outcome, then naturally I will question whether this and that is in fact religion or not. So the dominant discourse in our time is that a man's money is his wife's money, and hers is her money. So what's yours is mine, and what mine is also mine, number one. And that a good Muslim man has a housewife who has 2 or 3 servants, and who has to do nothing else but look pretty for her husband when he comes home. And that's it. That is the sum total of this creature called woman, despite that Allah gave her abilities and a brain and capabilities sometimes far exceeding that of some men. So we need to look into that. Now, people obviously laud this kind of mentality, this type of jurisprudence, as being part of why Islam is so feminist in approach. It's so glorious when it comes to women's rights, that a woman has to do absolutely nothing, and she can just lounge around all day in her house and polish her nails and wait for her husband to come home and just look pretty for him. And this is a great thing. But actually it is quite the opposite. Okay? that is in effect slavery, if you think about it more critically. Because to make people, a whole group of people, 50% of humanity, incapable and useless, is to enslave them. That's the bottom line. Okay? If your woman cannot do anything other than polish her nails, then she is, in principle, reliant on you to an extent, sometimes even more than what a child would be reliant on you. And this handicaps her in a way that is inhumane, to be frank. Okay? Rather, real woman empowerment would be to make the woman, to have the woman be capable woman, highly capable. Okay? And if a woman is highly capable, well, then she has to be responsible. And this is my argument. Okay? Because you cannot say that, okay, we have now made women capable, they are financially literate, they can they are capable of earning their own money, they are capable of earning even more than most men, okay, but they are not financially obligated. So that is un-Islamic, that is not in line with the entire logic of the Qur'an, in fact. Okay, which is capability equals accountability equals responsibility. That is the whole ethos of the Quran. But when it comes to women, we say no, they should be given the right to walk like a man, talk like a man, act like a man, but when it comes to responsibilities of a man, no, then they mustn't have that. Okay, if we must use form of gendered expression. Okay, not that. That's where I want to go with this. Okay, so let us begin. So that's the backdrop of why I decided to look into this matter, and then these are my findings. So we start with the Quran, and I'm going to read an entire segment to sort of contextualize the issue. So, in the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful. This is chapter 4, the chapter of woman. O mankind, fear your Lord who created you from one soul and created its mate, and dispersed from both of them many men and women. And fear Allah, through whom you ask one another, and the wombs. Indeed, Allah is ever over you an observer. So this verse shows us that the rights we are given are due to us because Allah gave them to us, and not because we get to decide that these are our rights, okay? So that's the first point I want to make. We are not the ones who give us ourselves rights. Allah is the one who gives us rights. And so we continue, and it says, and give to the orphans their properties, and do not substitute the defective of your own for the good of theirs, and do not consume their properties into your own. Indeed, that is ever a great sin. And if you fear that you will not deal justly with the orphan girls, then marry those that please you of other women, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you will not be just, then marry only one, or those your right hands possess. That is more suitable, that you may not incline to injustice. The above 2 verses should be read together. Unfortunately, because people have tried to argue against polygyny, they have decontextualized the verse, which happens to mention it, but missed the entire discussion underway in the process. The Quran is dealing with orphans, women, and money as a theme in Surah Al Nisa. Mainly, it is guarding the woman's wealth against stingy guardians who do not want to release the wealth of the orphans, or who want to marry women and not spend on them equitably, or simply because they do not have the means to marry. Men who were guardians of orphan girls had to, according to the Quran, give the orphan girls their wealth when they reached the age of marriage, as we already mentioned above. Instead of releasing the orphan girl with her wealth, the guardian would set out to instead marry the orphan girl himself and keep her wealth. So this is the injustice it's talking about. The Qur'an then sets out to tell these men in layperson's terms, look, you can marry any number of women, so why do you instead want to try to usurp the wealth of the orphan? But assuming you do marry then, and give the woman upon marriage their bridal gifts graciously, but if they give up willingly to you anything of it, then take it in satisfaction and ease. That's verse 4 of 4. So I'm reading you the whole segment. Still on the theme of stinginess, the Qur'an continues to remind men to spend. It is addressing people amongst whom there are those who want to usurp the wealth of the orphan by justifying it through marriage. The Qur'an is countering that justification in 10 verses, not just one. And so we see here, we continue, it says, the next verse, verse 5, and do not give the weak-minded your property, which Allah has made a means of sustenance for you, but provide for them with it, and clothe them, and speak to them words of appropriate kindness. So here the Qur'an is telling us the weak-minded, i.e. these are women who are not able to manage property. So Allah is saying you look after them with what Allah has given you. And it goes on and it says, however, now this is verse 10, so I'm just pointing out the direction, the theme, okay? However, if the orphan under your care, who came with their own inheritance, cannot manage property well on her own, then you manage the property and use it to provide for her. The segment then ends with, indeed, those who devour the property of orphans unjustly are only consuming into their bellies fire, and they will be burned in a blaze in the hellfire. So that is verse 10, so the end of the segment. So 10 verses all talking about wealth and usurping the wealth of women and orphans. And so here we go on and it says, so we're going to get to the issue of maintenance, okay? Just bear with me because, you know, it is very easy to just have snippets of information here and there and then come to a conclusion and then everybody claps hands and yay, you know, it's so great. That's not, we must get out of this kind of a pop culture nonsense, okay? So let's continue. As you can see, this is not at all about marrying the orphans, it's about looking after them. However, because wives, that which your right hand possess, and the theme of orphans are interwoven, we get the sense that women should be looked after like orphans. However, notice that these orphans are being looked after with their own money if needed. And also, when the surah gets to inheritance, then men inherit half of what their wives have. All this assumes throughout the surah that women have wealth of their own, and their wealth actually goes towards something either regarding themselves or even inherited by their husbands, no less. In fact, husbands inherit more from their wives than wives inherit from their husbands. So we get back to the question of maintenance. Where is the obligation of maintenance? So what I'm showing here is, when it comes to the orphans, here we see the Qur'an is mainly cautioning men not to usurp the wealth of the orphan, okay, unjustly. But the Qur'an is also saying that you can look after the orphan or the woman with their own money, okay. So what we see here is that in this instance, the money of the woman counts for something towards her own upkeep. This is what it's showing. This is what the Qur'an is saying to us. Okay, it is clearly discussing this at length, not just one verse, at length 10 verses. Okay, so let us continue. It is implicitly implied sometimes and at times explicit, right? The issue of maintenance, that is, okay. For example, when the verse above says, if you cannot do justice, then only one, or that which your right hands possess. It is talking about wealth. Okay, we know this because of the following verse in the same surah. And whoever among you cannot find the means to marry free believing women, then he may marry from those whom your right hands possess of believing slave girls. And Allah is most knowing about your faith. You, the believers, are one of another. So marry them with the permission of their people and give them their due compensation according to what is acceptable. They should be chaste, neither of those who commit unlawful intercourse randomly, nor those who take secret lovers. But once they are sheltered in marriage, if they should commit adultery, then for them is half the punishment for free women. This allowance is for him among you who fears sin, but to be patient is better for you, and Allah is forgiving and merciful. So this verse, of course, shows you that if you cannot afford, you don't have the money to marry the quote-unquote free believing woman, okay, then you may marry the quote-unquote slave. And what's the difference? The difference obviously is that you incur less financial expenses when marrying a woman who is not from the free believing woman, but is from the woman who are of the slave class of woman. So let us continue, and it says, the injustice is to marry a woman you cannot afford to look after financially. We also see that it is not preferred for the believer to marry that which your right hands possess. As the verse states, to be patient is better. In other words, it is better to wait until one has the means to wed the free believing woman. So it is obvious that having the means to marry is a necessary condition so that one can look after one's woman financially. However, this is assuming the woman doesn't herself have money. It becomes obvious when considering that the rich orphan is essentially financially independent on herself, even though she is under a guardian, that a woman can be cared for with her own money. We see that the rule of male maintenance of woman isn't hard and fast in the following verse. So what are we saying? We are saying essentially that when the Qur'an tells you if you don't have the means wherewith to wed the free believing woman, implies maintenance, of course. Okay, so the man, as a rule, has to have money to be able to get married because he's taking on a dependent. That is the assumption. That is the assumption generally because throughout human history and human societies, that has been and still is in many countries the condition of women. They are dependents, right? But then we see that there is nuance in the Quran. And where does the nuance come from? We see in the next verse, in chapter 2, verse 221, it says, and do not marry polytheistic women until they believe. And a believing slave woman is better than a polytheist, even though she might please you. And do not marry polytheistic men to your woman until they believe. And a believing slave is better than a polytheist, even though he might please you. Those invite you to the fire, but Allah invites you to paradise and to forgiveness by His permission. And He makes clear His verses to the people that perhaps they may remember. So why is that significant? Okay. It is significant because the slave man is not on par in Arab society anyway of them now too with the woman, with the free believing woman. And yet here God says it is better even that you marry the slave man. And of course one does not assume wealth on the part of the slave. So it could be argued, of course, that this verse is merely hyperbolic and not literal. However, if it were literal, then a free believing woman could marry a believing slave. It might be assumed that his wealth status couldn't be up to the task. Remember the earlier verse just announced that one might not have the means to wed a free believing woman, meaning that in the worst case scenario of permissible matters, a free believing woman may even marry a believing man who is technically without wealth rather than marry a disbeliever. In that scenario, it could be argued that the woman could be the one with the wealth and not the slave. In fact, historically, something similar happened to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he married a wealthy woman called Khadija radiallahu anha, who he worked for. Technically, she was the one with the wealth and not him. Another instance similar to that occurred with the aristocrat cousin of the Prophet and who became the mother of the believers, Zainab bint Jash radiallahu anha, who married Zayd bin Haritha radiallahu an. To conclude, it is implicit in the many verses that talk about marriage or care of women and orphans that the responsibility either to have the means to marry or to manage the means that belongs to the woman without mixing it up with your wealth, with your own wealth, is needed in the event that they, the woman, are unable to manage their money themselves. So what does it say here? In other words, what the general idea that you get from the Qur'an when taken holistically is that a man can marry a woman through his own wealth, okay? And of course, then he has the means wherewith to marry, then he marries a woman who now is a dependent of his. Or a man can be married to a woman who is not a dependent of his because she has her own wealth, in which case he is not supposed to mix her wealth up with his wealth in order to usurp it. So he needs to strictly guard the wealth that is hers because it belongs to her, meaning you need to protect the ownership of wealth that belongs to the woman. And both these are actual possibilities in the Qur'an, okay? And that does not at all negate anything with regards to marriage and the rights of men and women. But now what we have done, and we have gone and said, contrary to the Qur'an, is that we say if a woman is inordinately wealthy in her own right, it is still the responsibility of the husband to maintain her. And that is simply not true. It is not true. It is the responsibility of the wealthy woman to maintain herself as she has done prior to marriage. Okay? Marriage is not a credit card. Okay? It's not the opening of a new bank account. The caution of the Qur'an is that the man not try to usurp the wealth of the woman that he's marrying. Because you see, now the man might marry the woman who's wealthy, and then he wants to try to usurp her wealth, as many men do and have done throughout history. And then the woman ends up with nothing because the man has now used the marriage as a means to take her wealth. But the Quran is saying that if she gives you the wealth, her money, as women are often inclined to do when they are married, then you can accept it with goodness and with a happy demeanor. Don't get offended because she's giving you the money and because you're the man, kind of thing, right? So this is kind of what we get out of all these verses that I've just quoted you, that the Quran is nuanced regarding marriage, okay? And then, of course, the general sort of teachings in the Quran is that those who have will spend on those who don't have. And this does not mean man or woman, gender, okay? As we know, women are also entitled to give zakah independently with their own wealth and their own money, because the Quran treats a woman as an adult, meaning she can be independently wealthy, have her own money, be obligated in religion with her money, the same as a man, but yet when it comes to the jurisprudence, we want to, of other things, of marriage, we want to say, no, a woman's money counts for absolutely nothing. Okay, if that were true, then you would not have the inheritance where a man inherits half his woman's wealth when she dies. The wife dies, a man inherits half. Why does he inherit from her? It doesn't make sense. Her money should count for nothing. He's never supposed to have access to her money. He's never supposed to touch her money. Her money is not supposed to mean anything. So how come he inherits half of the money? And yet the Qur'an tells us about inheritance that distribute the inheritance as if it were that you left a helpless family behind, meaning that the inheritance has a specific purpose of looking after the family. So in this case, if the man is to inherit half of the woman's wealth, that means the woman's wealth is now going towards looking after the family, which means that a woman is in the Quran is actually treated as an adult, but in jurisprudence she's treated as a child. So let's continue. To conclude, it is implicit in the many verses that talk about marriage or care of women and orphans that the responsibility either to have the means to marry or to manage the means that belongs to the woman without mixing it up with your own wealth is needed in the event that they, the woman, are unable to manage the money themselves. In other words, marriage requires wealth, whether it be a little or a lot. We can see from the above discussion that the approach is nuanced in the Quran regarding maintenance, but it predominantly places the responsibility on the man. A possible reason for this is that most women who get married fall pregnant and are largely incapacitated for long periods of time and bear the greater responsibility towards nurturing the infant children. Therefore, one cannot expect a person who ordinarily doesn't make an income to support herself financially. However, in the case of women, as we saw with the orphans, who had a good inheritance, it was possible to use the inheritance on the orphans themselves. Since the Quran bundled the discussion of orphans along with the discussion of women and marriage, it is easy to create this analogy. And so there we have it. You can go back to the Quran and look at these verses yourself, read it, and also read up on the inheritance and read up on the duties, and then you will find that it is not abnormal in any way for women to be financially responsible and or financially obligated, because the Quran does not treat women like useless people who are just a burden to society and are responsible for nothing. Okay, but that is unfortunately how we go about our jurisprudence, because we want to treat women as objects to satisfy the sexual desires of men, period, end of story. Okay, and that's their only job in life, and that's all they are. And this is a very cultural approach to women and to how women are viewed in very specific cultures. And this is not what the Quran teaches. وصلى الله على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم. Thank you very much.